My topic is focusing on one unit from Fort Carson, one infantry unit that went to Iraq and had really horrible experiences and came back with so much trauma that they essentially brought a crime wave back to Colorado Springs. Most of the disasters that happen in Colorado Springs are obvious. If it's a flood, you know about it. If it's a drought, you know about it. This was one that until we really sort of identified what was going on, it wasn't clear that it was a disaster at all. I worked at the newspaper, and when you work at the newspaper and a murder happens, you know about it, and you write about it the next day, usually on the front page. And so we kept having one soldier after another arrested for murder. Now, one person arrested for murder is news, but it's not a disaster. It's not a community-wide problem. And even with the number of murders that we saw coming from soldiers, it was borderline whether it was a big problem, but it caught my interest. I looked at the news we were reporting and I said, why are we seeing so many soldiers? Is there something more behind this? And what turned out to be the disaster is it wasn't just 12 soldiers out of 30,000 at Fort Carson that were arrested. It was 12 soldiers that were from one specific Army unit. And so their murder rate, if you broke down the numbers, turned out to be 100 times higher than the murder rate for the rest of the city. When you have a murder rate spike like that, that's a disaster. I had just had to ask the simple question, what happened to these guys? Why these guys? Why no one else? The place that I started to try and figure out this story of murder was with the murderers. I went and talked to most of them in prison, and then through them I asked them to connect me with their friends who had been with them in Iraq but were now not in the Army, and I figured those guys could corroborate what they said but wouldn't be afraid of being punished by the Army. The essential story of their unit was that they were sent to the worst place in Iraq at the worst time. They received casualties at many times the average rate, even for combat units. They had nothing in terms of mental health resources there because they deployed in a hurry. And when they came home, any type of education about post-traumatic stress disorder, or whatever you want to call it, about the psychological injuries of war was basically a joke. They were encouraged to shrug it off, and they were discouraged to go and get help. A lot of them started having real problems. And then, before they could even sort of readjust to normal life, they were sent back to Iraq again to the very worst place, again to take casualties at many times the rate. And what happened was a lot of them turned psychotic. I remember asking one guy, he was a medic and was a close friend of a lot of the guys who was arrested for murder. He never was arrested for murder, but he did try to commit suicide shortly after coming home. He was telling me about how, as the tours progressed, they learned that it's either you or them, and the rules don't really apply. And so they would often, if they saw guys in their neighborhood in Baghdad, if they saw Iraqis on roofs who appeared to be watching them, they would shoot them. That's not allowed. You can't shoot an unarmed man. And they broke the rules, and I asked him, well, how did you justify that? How could you justify shooting someone who was unarmed just standing on a roof in his own neighborhood? And he said to me, well, you could be judged by 1,000 people tomorrow or carried by 6 people today. And that's how they thought. And I think to a certain extent they were right. But what it did is it turned them into someone, when they came home, who no longer knew how to play by our rules. And that, in essence, is what the disaster was. They've occupied moral territory that we haven't. And so they see things differently from us. And we wrote a book about it because I thought to myself, this is news. It is a newsworthy thing. The Army is creating a problem that is causing death to our citizens. If it had been any other industry, a mine or, a car maker or something where you could show, look, because of this, the death rate has spiked, people would freak. And I think a lot of times we don't think of the military as an industry or a major employer, but in Colorado Springs, come on. It is the employer. It is our whole economy. Without it, the next biggest part of our economy is literally Walmart. What's really gratifying about it is it helped and continues to help educate people at Fort Carson about what went on, because I think even though they were in the middle of it, they didn't know. They didn't know where this unit had come from. They didn't know what these guys had been through. They only see a lot of times what happens back in the United States. The murder rate has dropped significantly. I think largely because people at Fort Carson recognized the problem and tried to address it. Is it cured? No. Will it affect us long term? I don't know. The Army, I think, is always going to be our major part of our economy. I don't see that changing. But hopefully it's changed how we realize we need to engage with the Army. Even though we've had so much news come out about Iraq and Afghanistan, I don't think many people know what these guys go through. I don't think that they know what a day in Iraq is really like. And I spent a lot of time talking to guys who really told me in detail what life is like for the average soldier. And let's remember, the average soldier is, I think the average age is like 24. And most of the guys I talked to were 21, 22. We're talking about people that we think of as sort of college kids, except they didn't go to college. Instead, they went to war. How does that experience shape the over 1 million people who've now deployed? I think we need to be aware of that, because it's going to be with us for a long time. We're a city of immigrants. I mean, I was born here, but the majority of people were not. We come from somewhere else. That's part of our history too, that we came from somewhere else. But there's history of the town that still echoes. You know, you can't understand how we ended up with a majority military economy unless you understand Spencer Penrose, and you understand Palmer, and you understand all these, unless you understand the gold rush. These things all are tied together. And so if you don't get it, you risk getting it wrong.